For decades, the world did not just admire Morgan Freeman, it trusted him. His voice became a kind of cultural sanctuary, steady, resonant, almost sacred. When he narrated a documentary, it felt definitive. When he played a mentor, a president, even God, audiences did not question it. He carried moral gravity in a way few actors ever have. But at 88, the mythology surrounding him feels heavier than ever, because behind the calm exterior lies a life marked by quiet pain, irreversible loss, and the complicated weight of longevity. Unlike many Hollywood legends, Freeman did not rise as a young prodigy. His fame arrived later, after years of grinding work in theater, television, and supporting roles that rarely made headlines. By the time films like Driving Miss Daisy and The Shawshank Redemption cemented his place in cinematic history, he was already in his 50s. That delayed breakthrough shaped him. He was never naive about the industry. He understood its volatility. He had waited too long to take success for granted. Yet even maturity cannot shield a man from what time inevitably takes. One of the deepest wounds came in 2015 with the tragic death of his step-granddaughter. It was not simply a public loss. It was a private devastation. Those close to him described a grief that altered him fundamentally. At 78, he faced the kind of heartbreak that feels almost unbearable at any age, but especially in later life, when the reservoir of emotional recovery is thinner. Publicly, he remained composed. Privately, the fracture was permanent. Grief at that stage is not dramatic or loud. It is enduring and heavy, carried quietly from one day into the next. Physical vulnerability followed its own cruel timeline. In 2008, a severe car accident left him with permanent nerve damage in his left hand. What many viewers notice as a glove in interviews is not a fashion choice. It is a reminder of chronic pain. For an actor whose power often lies in subtle gestures and physical stillness, that injury mattered. Pain became a constant undercurrent, something he has acknowledged in interviews without dwelling on it. There is something profoundly human about that image. The man once cast as omnipotent, living with daily physical limitation. Aging itself brings another layer of tragedy, especially for someone mythologized as timeless. Hollywood tends to preserve its legends in their prime, endlessly replaying scenes from decades past. But reality does not pause. At 88, Freeman exists in the paradox of survival. Longevity is a triumph, yet carries a cost. Many contemporaries are gone. Directors he trusted, co-stars who shared formative roles, peers who understood the industry at its peak. One by one, they have disappeared. To live long is to attend more funerals than premieres. Then came the reputational turbulence of 2018, when allegations surfaced that cast a shadow over his long-standing image of integrity. He denied wrongdoing, but the cultural climate had changed. The era of untouchable icons was over. Even the suggestion of misconduct can permanently complicate a public legacy. For an actor whose persona was built on moral authority, who played figures of wisdom and justice, the contrast was striking. Regardless of legal conclusions, something intangible shifted. The unquestioned trust that once surrounded his name became more fragile. And yet, what makes this stage of his life heartbreaking is not scandal, nor even age alone. It is contrast. For years, audiences projected strength onto him. They saw certainty, guidance, reassurance. He became a symbol, but symbols are still human beings. They experience doubt. They experience fatigue. They endure losses that cameras never fully capture. The deeper tragedy may be that the world continues to expect the voice of calm omniscience, even as the man carrying it navigates the vulnerabilities of advanced age. Freeman has spoken occasionally about mortality with a matter-of-fact tone. He does not dramatize it. He does not seek sympathy. That restraint, however, can be deceptive. There is an emotional isolation that often accompanies legendary status. When the world sees you as larger than life, it becomes difficult to reveal fragility without shattering the illusion. And at 88, illusion and reality coexist in increasingly delicate balance. Still, he continues to work selectively. He appears, he narrates, he lends his voice to projects that align with his pace. There's resilience in that persistence. It is not the explosive vitality of youth, but the deliberate endurance of a man who understands that every additional year is both gift and burden. The tragedy is subtle. It is not collapse. It is accumulation of sorrow, of physical strain, of public scrutiny, of memory. At this stage, his story is less about fame and more about legacy. Not the awards or the box office numbers, but the imprint left on generations who grew up hearing that unmistakable cadence. Yet legacy is a strange companion. It grows stronger even as the body weakens. It becomes monumental just as the man becomes more fragile. And perhaps that is the most poignant element of all. The voice that once felt eternal now carries the quiet undertone of time. Not diminished, but weathered. Not broken, but human. There is something uniquely complex about growing old in front of the world when the world has frozen you in a version of yourself that no longer exists. For Morgan Freeman, the public memory is almost cinematic. The composed narrator in The Shawshank Redemption, the patient mentor in $1 Million Baby, the commanding presence in Invictus. These roles did more than define his career. They defined how audiences emotionally positioned him. He became a figure of reassurance. But age does not preserve the roles we once embodied. It quietly dismantles them. At 88, Freeman stands at a crossroads that few global icons ever openly discuss. The gradual transition from being the embodiment of strength to becoming a symbol of endurance. Endurance is quieter. It is less glamorous. It requires accepting limitations that would have once been unthinkable. In interviews over recent years, there have been subtle signs, slower movements, longer pauses, a more deliberate cadence. Not diminished, but altered. Time leaves fingerprints, even on legends. One of the most unspoken realities of late life is isolation. Not physical isolation, necessarily, but generational distance. The Hollywood that crowned Freeman in the 1990s is no longer the same industry. Studios have changed leadership. Audience tastes have shifted. The cultural authority once granted to elder statesmen of cinema is now fragmented across digital platforms and streaming algorithms. For a man who rose through theater discipline and classical storytelling, the modern entertainment machine can feel unfamiliar. That displacement, though rarely discussed publicly, can be emotionally disorienting. There is also the psychological burden of reputation. When you are repeatedly cast as moral authority, presidents, judges, mentors, even God, you internalize an expectation. The audience does not merely want performance. They want confirmation. It wants the man behind the roles to reflect the integrity of the characters. When allegations surfaced years ago, regardless of their legal trajectory, the emotional shock for fans was profound because it disrupted narrative continuity. It forced audiences to reconcile the human with the myth. For Freeman himself, that rupture likely carried its own internal conflict. To be seen differently after decades of reverence is not just a public challenge. It is a private reckoning. And yet, he did not retreat entirely. That may be one of the most revealing aspects of this chapter. He could have withdrawn into silence, chosen complete seclusion, allowed his legacy to fossilize untouched. Instead, he continued appearing, selectively, deliberately. There is quiet defiance in that decision. It signals an unwillingness to let the narrative close prematurely. Physically, however, the passage of time is uncompromising. Chronic nerve damage from the 2008 accident remains a constant presence. Pain management becomes part of daily structure. At 88, recovery is no longer swift. Fatigue is more frequent. The body negotiates terms that youth once ignored. For an actor whose instrument includes voice, posture, breath, and stillness, these changes require adaptation. Continuing to perform under those conditions is not effortless resilience. It is disciplined persistence. What deepens the heartbreak is that Freeman's public persona always radiated certainty. Certainty about justice. Certainty about resilience. Certainty about wisdom prevailing. But life rarely offers such narrative closure. Loss accumulates quietly. The death of loved ones, the fading of peers, the slow contraction of social circles. These are not cinematic tragedies. They are intimate ones. And intimacy is harder to dramatize, but often more painful. There is also the existential dimension. Freeman has spoken candidly at times about death, not with fear, but with philosophical acceptance. That acceptance can be misinterpreted as emotional distance. In reality, it often reflects contemplation. When you reach 88, mortality is no longer abstract. It becomes present in routine medical checkups, in headlines about contemporaries, in the mirror's subtle changes. Living with that awareness while maintaining public composure requires emotional calibration few can comprehend. Another dimension often overlooked is legacy management. Late-stage career decisions are no longer about expansion. They are about preservation. Which projects to attach his voice to? Which appearances to make? Which interviews to grant? Each choice contributes to how history will frame him. That awareness can be both empowering and suffocating. The more monumental the legacy, the more carefully one must step. And still, when he speaks, something remarkable remains. The timbre may be slightly more textured, the pauses more pronounced, but the authority endures. That endurance is perhaps the most poignant aspect of all. It suggests that while the body negotiates time's demands, the essence that captivated generations persists. It is weathered, not erased. The tragedy at 88 is not scandal. It is not even decline in the dramatic sense. It is the quiet confrontation between myth and mortality, between how the world sees a man and how that man experiences his own finite existence. Freeman once narrated stories about hope breaking through prison walls. Now, his own story is about navigating the final chapters with dignity intact. What makes this stage emotionally powerful is its subtlety. There is no explosive downfall, no catastrophic unraveling. Instead, there is accumulation of memory, of grief, of physical strain, of public expectation. The heartbreak lies in recognizing that even the voices we considered eternal belong to human beings subject to time. At 88, Morgan Freeman does not represent invincibility. He represents survival. Survival of industry cycles. Survival of personal tragedy. Survival of physical trauma. Survival of cultural shifts. Survival of scrutiny. And survival, though heroic, is rarely painless. When future generations revisit his performances, they will hear strength, assurance, and gravitas. What they may not hear is the quiet cost behind it, the resilience required to carry that voice through decades of personal and professional turbulence. And perhaps that is the final paradox. The more immortal the art, the more fragile the artist. If part emotive was about mythology and part high about endurance, then this chapter is about reckoning. Because at 88, the most difficult confrontation is not with critics, aging, or even loss. It is with the self. When a man has lived nearly 9 decades, when he has inhabited presidents, prisoners, detectives, mentors, and deities, there comes a moment when the costumes fall away and only reflection remains. Morgan Freeman built a career on composure. He rarely displayed emotional volatility in public. His interviews have long carried a measured calm, a philosophical detachment that many interpreted as wisdom. But composure can also be armor, and armor, when worn too long, can become isolating. The expectation that you are always the steady one, the rational one, the voice of reason, that expectation leaves little space for visible vulnerability. The paradox of his life is that he became globally revered for portraying moral clarity, yet real life rarely offers clarity. In later years, Freeman has spoken in a more stripped-down way about fate, belief, and mortality. He has described himself as a skeptic in some spiritual matters, resistant to simplistic narratives about heaven or divine reward. That candor reveals something essential. He is not the characters he portrayed. He is a man who has wrestled with uncertainty, just like anyone else. The tragedy lies in how long audiences insisted on conflating the two. There is also the question of identity beyond performance. When your voice becomes iconic, when your presence signals gravitas automatically, who are you when the cameras stop? For actors who peak young, retirement can feel like a natural arc. For Freeman, whose major fame arrived in midlife, the arc stretches differently. He spent decades building relevance. Stepping away now is not merely leaving a job. It is releasing a cultural role he has inhabited for half a lifetime. Financially, he achieved extraordinary success. Awards, nominations, global recognition. These are not small accomplishments. But success does not immunize against loneliness. In fact, the higher the pedestal, the narrower it becomes. The circle of equals shrinks. Conversations shift. Trust becomes more cautious. When you are recognized everywhere you go, anonymity, that simplest human freedom, disappears. At 88, one wonders whether he misses obscurity more than applause. His Mississippi ranch has often been described as a retreat, a sanctuary away from Hollywood's machinery. That choice says something profound. It reflects a man who values distance from the spectacle. Yet even retreat does not silence memory. Memory is relentless in later life. It replays choices. It revisits crossroads. It re-examines regrets. Every long life contains moments that, if given another chance, might have unfolded differently. And perhaps that is where the deepest heartbreak resides, not in what the public knows, but in what it never will. The private disappointments. The relationships strained by career demands. The roles declined or accepted. The times he may have wished to speak differently or act differently. No legacy erases personal imperfection. There is also the inevitability of physical slowing. Voice remains powerful, but breath requires more control. Appearances demand more energy. Travel is no longer effortless. The industry that once revolved around his availability now adjusts to his pace. That shift can feel empowering, control over schedule, selective participation, but it also signals transition. The world begins preparing for a future without you long before you are ready to leave it. Yet there is something quietly admirable in how he carries this phase. No public spectacle of decline. No dramatic farewell announcements. Instead, a measured continuation. He narrates. He participates. He observes. It is the posture of a man who understands that legacy is not declared. It settles gradually. Culturally, Freeman represents an era of cinema that valued presence over speed. His performances were rarely frantic. They were grounded, thoughtful, deliberate. In an entertainment landscape now driven by rapid cuts and viral moments, that style feels almost archival. And yet it endures. Young filmmakers still seek his voice for documentaries because it communicates credibility in seconds. That relevance at 88 is not accidental. It is earned. But relevance does not silence existential awareness. Aging often sharpens introspection. There is less appetite for pretense, less tolerance for superficiality. Interviews in recent years suggest a man less interested in maintaining myth and more interested in authenticity. That authenticity can appear blunt. It can even unsettle audiences who prefer their icons polished. Yet perhaps this is the most human stage of all, shedding expectation. The tragedy of Morgan Freeman at 88 is not that he has fallen. It is that he has become profoundly human in a world that once insisted on treating him as transcendent. The heartbreak lies in watching a symbol reconcile with mortality. It lies in recognizing that the voice that guided us through stories is navigating his own final chapters without narrative certainty. There is dignity in that. There is gravity in that. And perhaps there is even quiet peace. Because survival to this age, with mind intact and voice still resonant, is not a small victory. It is a testament to resilience. But resilience does not erase the shadows. It coexists with them. The grief, the controversy, the physical pain, the awareness of limited time. All of it layers beneath the calm exterior. And so the question becomes not how history will remember him. That is already assured, but how he remembers himself. When the applause fades, when the cameras stop, when the night settles over the Mississippi landscape, does he feel fulfillment? Or does he feel the ache of everything time has taken? At 88, the world still hears Morgan Freeman as a voice of certainty. But behind that certainty is a man living with the same fragility that defines us all. There's a moment in every long life when legacy stops being a future concept and becomes a present reality. For Morgan Freeman, that moment likely arrived years ago, not with an award, not with a standing ovation, but with the quiet realization that the world now speaks about him in historical terms. At 88, he is no longer simply an active actor. He is an institution. And institutions carry a different kind of pressure. When audiences watch his earlier performances today, they're not just revisiting films. They are revisiting eras. The restrained strength in The Shawshank Redemption, the moral authority in Say 7 Un, the quiet mentorship in $1 Million Baby. These are now cultural artifacts. They represent a time when storytelling felt slower, dialogue felt weightier, and character development unfolded with patience. Freeman's style became synonymous with that era. But being synonymous with a past golden age can be both an honor and a burden, because time does not pause to protect legacies. As the industry evolves, as new generations of actors redefine stardom through social media presence and rapid fame cycles, Freeman stands almost as a relic of a different system, one built on apprenticeship, stage discipline, and incremental growth. He did not chase viral moments. He built gravitas brick by brick. That kind of career path is increasingly rare. Watching it transition into history is bittersweet. There's also the unspoken psychological impact of witnessing your own canonization. Interviews increasingly frame him as one of the last great voices, a living legend, an icon of cinema. These labels are flattering, but they also subtly signal finality. They suggest culmination. For a man still breathing, still thinking, still creating in measured ways, being treated as a completed chapter can feel premature. At 88, the concept of control becomes central. Control over narrative, control over appearance, control over the pace of engagement. Freeman has long valued independence. Financially secure, geographically distanced from Hollywood's constant glare, grounded in his Mississippi property. That environment offers autonomy. Yet autonomy does not eliminate vulnerability. Health becomes less predictable. Energy fluctuates. The margin for physical strain narrows. And yet, the voice remains astonishingly intact. That voice, deep, textured, instantly recognizable, continues to command attention. It is both a blessing and a haunting reminder of continuity. Even as the body negotiates aging, the instrument that defined him persists. That persistence creates emotional contrast. Audiences hear strength and assume vitality, but vitality at 88 is measured differently. It is deliberate, conserved. Another layer of heartbreak lies in how little space society gives aging men to express fragility without losing stature. Freeman has never publicly indulged in self-pity. He speaks with matter-of-fact realism. But realism does not equal emotional immunity. Behind philosophical acceptance, there can still be quiet fear. Fear of physical decline. Fear of cognitive erosion. Fear of irrelevance. These fears are universal, yet magnified when lived under global recognition. There is also the weight of memory. When you have lived through the civil rights era, through decades of industry change, through technological revolutions in filmmaking, your internal archive becomes vast. Freeman's life spans segregation, social upheaval, analog cinema, digital transformation, and streaming dominance. That historical breadth carries perspective, but perspective can also intensify awareness of impermanence. Perhaps one of the most poignant elements of this stage is reconciliation. With career choices, with relationships, with public perception. At 88, reconciliation is less about ambition and more about alignment. Does the life lived align with the values held? Does the work created reflect the man within? These questions grow louder when time feels finite. The tragedy often described in headlines focuses on isolated events, loss, injury, controversy. But the deeper tragedy is quieter. It is the slow shedding of roles, not characters on screen, but roles in life. Mentor to younger actors becomes elder observer. Leading man becomes revered guest presence. Central figure becomes legacy figure. None of these transitions are dramatic. They are gradual. Yet they alter identity profoundly. And still, there is dignity in how he inhabits this phase. No desperate attempts to cling to youth. No theatrical declarations of immortality. Instead, measured participation, thoughtful commentary, selective storytelling. That restraint reflects maturity earned through decades of scrutiny. If there is heartbreak, it is rooted in contrast between the almost mythic aura that surrounded him at his peak and the inevitable human reality of aging. The world once cast him as God in Bruce Almighty. Today, he navigates doctor appointments and energy limits like anyone else in their late 80s. The juxtaposition is humbling. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of this chapter is acceptance. Not passive resignation, but clear-eyed awareness. Freeman has often spoken about living fully rather than fearing death. That philosophy suggests a man who understands that longevity itself is extraordinary. Reaching 88 with intellectual clarity and continued relevance is no small achievement. Yet survival comes with a cost. It means carrying grief longer. It means outliving peers. It means witnessing cultural shifts that redefine everything you once knew. The emotional labor of that endurance is rarely visible. As audiences, we hear his voice and feel steadiness. We see his face and recall strength. But behind that recognition is a man quietly measuring his remaining time, balancing memory with presence, legacy with humanity. The tragedy of Morgan Freeman at 88 is not collapse. It is confrontation with mortality, with myth, with memory. It is the understanding that even the most resonant voices eventually soften into history. And perhaps that is not purely tragic. Perhaps it is profoundly human. If the earlier chapters of Morgan Freeman's life were defined by ascent, recognition, and endurance, then this stage feels like a slow illumination of truth. Not scandal-driven truth, not tabloid spectacle, but existential truth. The kind that arrives when a man has lived long enough to see his own myth separate from his humanity. There's something profoundly sobering about being 88 years old in a culture obsessed with youth. Hollywood celebrates reinvention at 40 and calls it bravery. It celebrates relevance at 60 and calls it resilience. But at 88, the celebration changes tone. It becomes reverent, almost fragile. Interviews shift from what's next to how do you reflect. That linguistic shift alone marks transition. Freeman once commanded sets with quiet authority. Directors trusted him implicitly. Co-stars leaned into his presence. His timing was precise. His gaze carried weight. Now, even when he appears on screen, there is a different energy. It is not diminished power. It is tempered gravity. Audiences are aware, sometimes painfully aware, that every new performance may be among the last. That awareness changes how scenes are received. Every line feels layered with history. What makes this particularly poignant is how strongly he resisted being defined by race early in his career. He deliberately avoided roles that reinforced stereotypes. He insisted on complex portrayals: judges, detectives, educators, leaders. He did not want to be the black actor in Hollywood. He wanted to be an actor, full stop. And he succeeded. In doing so, he quietly expanded representation without loudly branding himself as a political figure. But age reframes even that achievement. At 88, Freeman is not just an actor. He is a generational bridge. He connects eras of civil rights struggle to contemporary discussions about representation. His mere presence carries historical symbolism. That burden of symbolism is heavy, because symbols are rarely allowed to be flawed, tired, or uncertain. The tragedy embedded in this chapter is not about downfall. It is about diminishing control. Aging introduces unpredictability. Health can fluctuate without warning. Energy becomes finite. Even voice, his most powerful instrument, requires careful preservation. When your identity is intertwined with a physical trait, its vulnerability becomes emotionally significant. There's also a quieter dimension rarely acknowledged, the recalibration of purpose. When you have achieved awards, wealth, recognition, and cultural immortality, what drives you at 88? Ambition fades. Competition loses urgency. What remains is meaning. Freeman has often gravitated toward documentary narration in recent years, projects exploring science, spirituality, and human curiosity. That shift suggests introspection. It suggests a man seeking understanding, not applause. But introspection can also magnify solitude. The Mississippi property, where he spends much of his time, is often described as peaceful. Yet peace and isolation are separated by thin lines. At 88, social circles shrink. Peers disappear. Conversations grow quieter. Even family structures evolve. Watching generations younger than you move faster, live louder, and think differently can feel both beautiful and alienating. And then there is the legacy question, not how the world will remember him, but how he feels about being remembered. When actors are alive, legacy feels theoretical. When they reach 88, it becomes tangible. Biographies are written. Retrospectives air. Film festivals honor lifetime achievements. These gestures are meaningful, but they also underscore finality. What complicates Freeman's story further is the public scrutiny that accompanied controversy. Even without legal condemnation, public perception is altered by allegation alone. For a man whose career was built on moral gravitas, that shift must have felt disorienting. The psychological impact of reputational turbulence late in life can be profound. It challenges identity at a stage when stability matters most. Yet he did not collapse under it. He did not retreat permanently. That persistence reflects internal strength, but strength does not erase hurt. It simply absorbs it. The most heartbreaking element may be the inevitability of farewell. Not dramatic farewell, but gradual one. Fewer projects, longer intervals between appearances, a voice heard slightly less often. Cultural memory begins preparing for absence before absence arrives. And the audience subconsciously braces itself. When people describe Morgan Freeman as timeless, they're expressing admiration. But time, ironically, is the very force reshaping him. His face carries deeper lines. His movements are measured. His interviews are reflective rather than promotional. These are not signs of decline. They're signs of life fully lived. Perhaps what makes this stage emotionally resonant is that it mirrors our own future. Watching a legend age forces confrontation with our own mortality. If Morgan Freeman, the voice of certainty, the embodiment of cinematic wisdom, must bow to time, then none of us are exempt. His aging becomes symbolic of universal vulnerability. And yet, there is quiet triumph here too. He did not fade into obscurity. He did not squander talent in self-destruction. He built a body of work that will outlive him. He shaped how authority sounds in modern cinema. That is no small accomplishment. The tragedy at 88 is layered. It is the sorrow of accumulated grief, the weight of public expectation, the physical constraints of age, the lingering shadows of controversy, the shrinking of time. But it is also the tragedy of humanity itself, that even the most resonant voices eventually soften. Morgan Freeman does not appear broken. He appears reflective. And reflection at 88 is not weakness, it is culmination. When the world listens to him now, perhaps what it truly hears is not just narrative authority, but the quiet echo of a life nearly complete, still dignified, still standing, but unmistakably aware that the final chapters are being written. By the time a man reaches 88, the world begins speaking about him in past tense, even when he is still very much alive. That subtle grammatical shift carries enormous psychological weight. For Morgan Freeman, whose presence once defined cinematic authority, hearing his own name framed as legacy rather than momentum must feel surreal. He is not gone. He is not silent. Yet the conversation around him has already started preparing for a world without him. There is something uniquely sobering about being celebrated while still breathing. Lifetime Achievement Awards, tribute reels, standing ovations that feel almost valedictory. These are honors, yes, but they also carry an undertone of closure. They imply that the peak has passed, that the story is complete enough to be summarized. For an artist who spent decades expanding his craft, being reduced to montage can feel both flattering and final. Freeman's career was built on discipline. He did not arrive through scandal or sudden youth-driven hype. He arrived through patience, theater training, small television roles, gradual refinement. His breakthrough came later than most leading men, which gave his success a different texture. It was not explosive, it was earned. That earned quality is why audiences trusted him so deeply. His authority felt authentic. Now, at 88, authenticity manifests differently. It is no longer about commanding screen time. It is about choosing when to appear at all. Selectivity becomes survival. Energy is no longer infinite. Recovery requires intention. The body negotiates boundaries that ambition once ignored. Chronic nerve damage from the 2008 accident remains a daily companion. Pain management is not dramatic, but it is constant. Living with that quiet discomfort while maintaining public composure reflects resilience that headlines rarely capture. Another unspoken dimension of late life is the relationship with memory. Memory can be companion or adversary. It brings pride, Oscar wins, cultural milestones, unforgettable roles. But it also brings regret, relationships strained by career demands, missed time with family, decisions made under pressure. At 88, the internal dialogue grows louder, not because of scandal or controversy, but because time sharpens introspection. Freeman has often spoken with philosophical detachment about death, suggesting that fearing it wastes energy better spent living. That perspective reads as calm, but calm does not mean absence of emotion. Acceptance can coexist with sadness. Awareness of mortality can deepen gratitude while simultaneously intensifying fragility. When contemporaries pass away, the reminder is immediate. The circle narrows. There is also the generational shift. Younger actors grew up watching him. Directors cite him as influence. Entire film students study his cadence and delivery. To be someone's reference point is powerful, but also places you firmly in history. Freeman now belongs to syllabi, to retrospectives, to curated streaming collections labeled classics. That transformation from active participant to benchmark is subtle, but irreversible. What makes his story emotionally resonant is the tension between immortality of art and mortality of artist. The Shawshank Redemption will play decades from now. His narration in documentaries will echo in classrooms long after he is gone. The performances are preserved digitally, immune to aging. But the man behind them is not. That contrast can feel almost cruel. Art remains vibrant, the body grows tired. And yet, he continues to work carefully. His voice still carries authority unmatched by many younger contemporaries. When he speaks, rooms quiet. That power remains intact. But there is a softness now, a reflective tone. Interviews feel less promotional and more contemplative. He is no longer proving anything. He is observing. The heartbreak embedded in this chapter is quiet. It is the reality that even the strongest figures eventually relinquish control. Projects slow. Appearances become rare. Travel is limited. The rhythm of life shifts from expansion to conservation. That shift is universal, but it feels magnified when experienced by someone once perceived as nearly untouchable. There is dignity in how he carries it. No desperate attempt to rebrand. No artificial youthfulness. No denial of age. Instead, measured presence. Occasional commentary. Select participation in projects aligned with curiosity rather than commerce. That evolution signals maturity rather than decline. Still, there is an emotional undercurrent impossible to ignore. The inevitability of farewell. Not dramatic farewell, but gradual fading. A voice heard less frequently. A face appearing less often on new posters. The industry adapting to absence before absence arrives. Cultural memory, rehearsing goodbye. At 88, Freeman's tragedy is not about collapse. It is about confrontation. Confrontation with time, with limitation, with the finite nature of even the most resonant voice. He once portrayed men who guided others through despair. Now, he quietly navigates his own twilight with composure. What remains undeniable is impact. He altered how authority sounds in modern cinema. He redefined late-career success. He demonstrated that gravitas can outshine glamour. Those achievements will endure. But endurance of reputation does not shield the heart from loneliness or the body from fatigue. Perhaps the most human element of all is this. Despite everything, awards, controversies, longevity, he is simply an 88-year-old man living each day with awareness of its value. Not myth, not symbol, not cinematic deity, just human. And that humanity, stripped of illusion, is both heartbreaking and profoundly beautiful. In the final analysis, the tragedy of Morgan Freeman at 88 is not spectacle. It is not collapse. It is not scandal. It is something far more intimate and far more universal. The slow, undeniable convergence between legend and mortality. For decades, Freeman's presence functioned almost as reassurance. When his voice entered a scene, chaos felt contained. When he narrated the mysteries of the universe, the unknown felt comprehensible. When he portrayed moral authority, justice felt inevitable. Audiences did not simply watch him. They leaned on him. His calm became cultural comfort. But comfort, when projected onto a single human being, creates expectation. An expectation can quietly imprison. The world wanted Morgan Freeman to remain steady forever, ageless, untouched by frailty, immune to contradiction. That desire was never realistic, but it was powerful. Now, at 88, reality has gently but unmistakably overtaken mythology. The physical signs are subtle, yet undeniable. Movement is more measured. Appearances are less frequent. Interviews carry reflective pauses that hint at contemplation rather than momentum. He does not chase headlines. He does not attempt reinvention. Instead, he occupies space deliberately, as if aware that every appearance is weighted. There is something profoundly human about that awareness. At this stage of life, time shifts texture. Days feel more valuable. Energy becomes currency. Relationships grow sharper in focus. The noise of ambition fades, replaced by clarity about what truly matters. For Freeman, that clarity appears to manifest in selectivity. He no longer needs validation from box office returns or award ceremonies. He has already etched his name into cinematic history. Yet history is a strange companion. It immortalizes performance while quietly preparing to archive the performer. Film reels and digital streams preserve youth. They freeze him in the vigor of his 40s, 50s, and 60s. Meanwhile, the man behind those images continues aging in real time. The contrast is stark. Audiences revisit the Shawshank Redemption and see timeless authority. Then they watch a recent interview and witness age. Both are true. That duality can feel disorienting. Another layer of tragedy lies in solitude. Not necessarily physical isolation, but existential separation. When you reach 88, the number of people who share your generational memory becomes small. Cultural references shift. Conversations change. Even humor evolves. To live long is to become a witness to eras others know only through textbooks. Freeman embodies that witness role. He lived through segregation, civil rights struggles, the evolution of black representation in Hollywood, the transition from analog filmmaking to digital streaming dominance. He did not merely observe change, he contributed to it. But witnessing also means outliving, and outliving carries emotional weight. There is also the quiet burden of controversy that lingers in public consciousness. Even when disputes fade from headlines, they alter narrative permanently. For someone whose brand was moral authority, even allegation reshapes perception. Navigating that reshaping at 88, when stability and dignity matter most, requires internal resilience rarely visible to outsiders. And yet, through all of it, his voice remains. That voice is almost symbolic of continuity. Deep, resonant, controlled. It carries decades of storytelling experience. When he narrates a documentary today, audiences still feel anchored. That anchoring power is extraordinary at any age, let alone 88. Perhaps the deepest heartbreak is this. He is no longer climbing. He is conserving. There are no new mountains to conquer. There is only maintenance of health, of legacy, of dignity. For a man whose life was defined by progression, that transition to preservation can feel like surrender, even when it is simply nature. But there is also grace here. Grace in accepting age without spectacle. Grace in appearing without desperation. Grace in allowing legacy to form organically rather than forcing it. Freeman does not appear to fight time aggressively. He seems to acknowledge it. That acknowledgement transforms tragedy into reflection. At 88, Morgan Freeman stands as proof that greatness does not prevent vulnerability. That authority does not cancel fragility. That immortality of art does not extend to flesh and bone. He remains respected, revered, studied. But he is also undeniably human, subject to fatigue, subject to grief, subject to the ticking clock. And maybe that is the most powerful message of all. The world once cast him as God on screen. Today, he reminds us of something more profound. Even the voices that feel eternal belong to men who age, who feel, who endure, and who eventually step aside. His tragedy is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the tragedy of time itself. And when future generations hear that unmistakable voice echo through classrooms, documentaries, and late-night film marathons, they will hear strength. What they may not hear is the cost of carrying that strength for nearly 9 decades. At 88, Morgan Freeman is no longer just a legend. He is a living meditation on impermanence, dignified, reflective, and still standing, even as the final chapters gently approach. End of series.